time. I mean, he is in some way, if you look at the history of the modern era, he's the man.
And the King has told politicians in Paris and the UK that the UK and France remain best friends. Speaking on the second day of his state visit, Charles thanked the country for their kindness towards the royal family after the Queen's death. He's made history by becoming the first British monarch to address the French Senate.
Our friendship and warm familiarity are fortified by each new connection between us. It is renewed by each newfound joy in the culture of the other.
In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 53 points at 76.78. The pound buys $1.22 and €1.15. LBC weather turning drier for most tonight. Sharp showers continuing in the far southeast of England with a low of 6 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. We're streaming this hour live on Global Play if you'd like to watch us. As you know, on a Thursday, we like to have one person in the studio. I talk to them a bit, then it's your chance to ask your questions. Today, we have the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper. She's MP for St Albans, elected first in 2019. In fact, I think, Daisy, welcome by the way, I think you were one of the first new MPs I interviewed in the studio straight after the election.
That's it. It was very cold and I had a scarf and a coat on, I think.
Yeah, it was cold. The studio gets very cold as well, so it's not surprising. And I remember thinking at the time, I can't remember exactly what I asked and I can't remember exactly what your answer was, but you were quite open that you'd quite like to lead the Liberal Democrats one day, which I thought was quite something for a new MP to say.
Well, I've been in the Liberal Democrats for quite some time. Obviously, I was incredibly excited to win my seat in St Albans. But I've said repeatedly since then, my first commitment is always to the people of St Albans. Obviously, I love being deputy leader. I love working alongside Ed Davey, who is our party leader. And I hope very much that we'll make a strong team going into the next general election.
Obviously, the election's only a year away. We had all of these green announcements, or maybe anti-green announcements, we can call them, from the Prime Minister yesterday. Let's start talking about those. But let me remind everyone that this is your hour as well. If you've got questions you'd like to put to Daisy between now and 9 o'clock, the number to call 0345 6060 973. If you can't call, do text 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. Were you surprised at what the Prime Minister did yesterday?
Yes, I was. I was really surprised. And I'm still quite shocked, to be honest. I really think that it was a turning point yesterday and in the wrong direction for the country. I think what it now shows the country is that this is a Conservative Party that has just given up on governing and instead they've resorted to gaslighting instead. The fact that they claimed that they were going to stop things that had never even been suggested by themselves or by anybody else was really quite extraordinary. I just think I think Sunak's announcement really has had huge ripple effects already. It's created uncertainty for business. I think investors will be looking to put their money in other countries aside from the UK. And I think it really undermines our standing on the world stage. You know, we were global leaders in the fight against the climate emergency. And it was because we had these strong targets that we were able to encourage other countries around the world to go further and faster. It gave us that moral authority. And in one fell swoop, Rishi Sunak's managed to undo all of that.
It's interesting because, I mean, individually, the announcements weren't actually that major, I don't think. I mean, all we've done on electric cars is delay it till 2035, which is what the EU did a few months ago themselves. But there has been a broad consensus among all political parties, I mean, really going back to the 1990s in a way, that these measures were good, that we have become, in some ways, world leaders on environmental change. And it does undermine that message, doesn't it? So do you think that this was purely just raw politics, creating a dividing line between the Conservatives and particularly Labour, but also yourselves?
Yes, I think that's all it was about. And I think it was a desperate move by a Prime Minister who knows that he's doing really badly in the polls. I think one of the things that was quite shocking yesterday was that, if you remember, a lot of people, when they voted for Boris Johnson all those years ago, sort of knew that he was a man renowned for lying from time to time. And that was ultimately what led to his downfall. But I think a lot of people thought that Rishi Sunak was different. He stood on the steps of Number 10 and said he wanted to put honesty and integrity at the heart of his premiership. And yesterday, by announcing that he was going to stop things that were never even on the table in the first place, kind of completely fabricated silly ideas that nobody had been calling for, suggests to me that he's actually worse than Boris Johnson.
I don't disagree with you on these fabricated ideas, because he continues to deny that they were fabricated. And there's one or two of them, you've seen them suggested by generally people who are on sort of the extreme of the argument, but not serious government proposals. And if they had been serious government proposals, what were they doing as serious government proposals in the first place? So either way, he kind of loses on that.
Precisely. Look, I think if any of these ideas had been considered even remotely seriously, there would have been a government consultation. We all would have heard about it. We would have been on shows like this debating the merits for and against, and largely against some of these sort of silly proposals.
So even you aren't in favour of a tax on red meat?
Absolutely not. I mean, no, it's a ridiculous idea. I mean, the fact is...
Compulsory car sharing?
I mean,
sounds
come on.
Sounds like a Lib Dem idea to me.
I'll give over. No, I don't think anybody in their right mind would call for things like this, And this is why it was so preposterous that he sort of set out his platform claiming to ban things that weren't even on the table, that no politician was calling for. There might have been, I don't know whether it was think tanks or whether it was, officials that had it as suggestions in a paper. I have no idea. But fundamentally, there were no politicians calling for these things. And then so to stand on a platform and claim that he was stopping these terrible things from happening was just absurd.
But of course, among many people, some of these changes in emphasis or changes in policy will be quite popular. People who are being affected by the cost of living crisis. I mean, the electric vehicle thing, I think, has gone down quite well with a lot of those people. But do you think it's just a lack of leadership, or it's just playing politics with a subject which has to have long-term solutions?
I think it shows a complete lack of leadership. I think it shows a Prime Minister who's incredibly weak. But let's knock this, argument on the head that some of this stuff is going to be expensive. You might recall that the Liberal Democrats were the very first party to call for a windfall tax on the big oil and gas companies when ordinary folk weren't able to heat their homes. And part of the reason we called for that windfall tax, partly to support people with their energy bills, but we also wanted to use some of that money to kickstart a 10-year home insulation programme. And the benefit of doing that would be that you would actually reduce people's energy consumption, you would reduce their energy bills, and you would save them money. The fact is that many of these measures are actually going to create the jobs of the future. And I think Rishi Sunak's announcement yesterday really cast doubt on the fact that we could be a world leader. We could be attracting that global investment in the green, high-tech jobs of the future. And, he's just, if you excuse the pun, he's set a bin fire underneath that, hasn't he?
He has. Now, let's talk about elections, because this time next year there could well be a general election in the offing. It might have already happened, who knows. There's obviously the Mid-Bedfordshire by-election going on at the moment, the one in Tamworth. There's been quite a lot of controversy about your campaign in Mid-Bedfordshire. I read today that Labour have sent a legal letter to the Liberal Democrats complaining about this. And at the start of last week, Labour Shadow Science and Technology Secretary Peter Kyle spoke to my colleagues at the Newsagents podcast and told Emily Maitlis that he's pretty disgusted by how the Lib Dems have been conducting their campaign in Mid-Bedfordshire. Let's just have a listen.
What I'm seeing from the Lib Dems is deeply personal. It is aimed at the person, our candidate, not at the policies or politics of the person or the party. And I see hints and I sense a style of politics by the Lib Dems in Mid-Bedfordshire which is reminiscent of the campaign they ran against Peter Tatchell in the 1980s. And I have no doubt, because they are so desperate to make an impact in Mid-Bedfordshire, that if our candidate was gay, they'd be doing a family values campaign. That's the level to
You're
which
saying they're homophobic now?
No, I'm saying that they would go nowhere. Moral high ground does not count in the way the Lib Dems are acting in that constituency.
Pretty strong accusations there from Peter Kyle. I think he's the Labour sort of bag carrier for the candidate there, sort of advising him. What's led to this? I mean, I know Lib Dems do have a reputation for, shall we say, robust campaigning in by-elections. You're keeping a very straight face there. What's going on here?
No, I'm keeping a straight face because I actually found some of those comments from Peter Kyle really quite offensive. We're a party that is inclusive. We're the party that introduced equal marriage. And so those particular comments, I think many of us in the Lib Dems found them deeply offensive. At best, I'd call them disappointing, but I did personally find them quite offensive. look, I can tell you what's happening on the ground. The fact is that the Liberal Democrats are the key challengers to the Conservatives.
Well,
and
they're not.
as part of the...
You came third last time. Labour came second.
Well, part of the frustration, let me answer the first bit first, I'll come to that. Part of the frustration of local people in mid-Bedfordshire is that they have had an MP for a long period of time, Nadine Dorries, who was out of town and out of touch. And we have simply highlighted that the Labour Party had selected a candidate who, until a few days ago, was a councillor in London. And that is simply it.
It did come from the area, I believe.
Sure, but was living in London and was a London councillor, and we simply highlighted that point. And that is a relevant point for people who are frustrated at the fact that they've had an MP for a long period of time who hasn't been very active in the area, who hasn't been living there, who hasn't been seen in the area, whereas our candidate is a local candidate in Bedfordshire. On the other point about sort of the winnability question, if you think back to 1997, Labour swept to power with an enormous majority, and even then they still didn't win mid-Bedfordshire. And that's because there is a natural cap on the number of people who are prepared to vote for the Labour Party in mid-Bedfordshire. We can see, however, that at the moment there are huge swathes of lifelong Conservative voters who cannot vote for the Conservative Party anymore. They won't countenance voting for the Labour Party, but they will consider voting for the Liberal Democrats. And if you go to some of the rural villages like I've been doing, you will find that there are scores of people who are prepared to vote for the Lib Dems, and they're switching coming our way.
Well, are they? Because the latest polling in mid-Bedfordshire has the Conservatives and Labour pretty much neck and neck, with Lib Dems in third, albeit close third.
So if you look at the series of polls recently, you'll see that the number of undecideds, people who haven't made up their mind how they're going to vote, has reduced from 40% down to around 25%. And as those number of people are making up their minds, what you can see is a few of them have gone towards Labour. There's been a tiny little increase for Labour in percentage terms, but there's been a very big increase for the Lib Dems. And if you look at some of our recent by-election wins that we've had, whether that's in Cheshire and Amersham, North Shropshire, Tiverton and Honiton, there are some examples there of where we have come from third place to win. And we've done that in areas that are just like mid-Bedfordshire.
Well, we'll see if that legal thing develops. I suspect it isn't, because all's fair in love and by-election campaigns, I suppose, up to a point. Before we come to calls, let's also look at what the result of the next election might be. Obviously, you are fighting to win as many seats as you can. I think there are a lot of very nervous Conservative MPs, particularly in the south of England, who are looking over their shoulders. And we had one of them in the studio last night, Angela Richardson, who's the Conservative MP for Guildford, which the Lib Dems held for 4 years back in the early part of the century, I think. And it's seats like that presumably you've got your eye on. But in by-elections, you can concentrate all of your campaigning into one seat. But in a general election, you obviously can't. You've got to fight across the country. How can you launch really impactful campaigns in these, what you would call blue wall seats?
Well, we are launching them already, and our party conference, which is coming up this weekend, really will start the firing gun, or fire the starting gun rather, for our general election campaign. What we've learned from the by-election wins that we've had over the last couple of years is that voters now, their frustration and their anger with the Conservative Party is really baked in. What they now want to know is what our plan is for getting things back on track. And so we've been launching very big single issue campaigns around the NHS and how we're going to fix our health and care services, around the cost of living and our plans to support those people with mortgages who have been really impacted by the mini budget and the fallout from that, and also our campaigns as well on how to protect the environment, tackle this outrageous injustice of big water companies raking in millions of pounds whilst at the same time destroying our natural environment. So we have these kind of big issues that we've been campaigning on. We've been sort of leading and winning the battle of ideas in these areas in Parliament, with other parties adopting our policies slowly, and we'll continue to fight on those issues.
You also, throughout the country, have accusations. Well, the Lib Dems say one thing in one area and something different in another. HS2, for example, is something where I think that is a subject where you sort of face both ways. And the Cheshire and Amersham by-election was, I think, an example of that, some people would say. Given also the news this week that the government appears to be about to cancel the Manchester and Leeds legs of HS2, what is the definitive position on HS2?
Well, let's remember, particularly on that point around Chesham and Amersham, you'll remember that even when the Conservatives were gung-ho about the HS2, it was their own former Conservative MP in that seat who was against it. And that's not unusual in a representative democracy where local people elect a local MP to stand up for their issues in their area. And I think it's healthy that individual MPs can actually speak out against their party when it really matters to their constituents. That's fundamentally what MPs are there to do, to speak up for their constituents. But on the issue of HS2, the Liberal Democrats have been long-term supporters of having HS2. But I think one thing that shocked all of us is the way that the bills have absolutely skyrocketed. I don't think there's been anywhere near enough transparency around how these bills have been allowed to rack up, quite frankly. I think there needs to be far more parliamentary scrutiny about how that's happened. And once we can get some transparency around that, then we can look at what is possible. But I think it's a very key piece of infrastructure, and I hope it's possible for us to continue to support it.
What about housing targets?
So we are debating that at our conference this weekend.
That's why I asked.
Yeah.
I'm that sad that I know these things.
That's good. You've done your homework. It's all good. Look, I really hope that this weekend we can adopt a target of building 150,000 social homes a year. We have a huge shortage of social homes in this country, and it's desperately needed.
Well, let's be very clear what that means, because there is a difference between affordable homes and social homes.
Yeah, sure.
Social homes, in common language, council homes.
Sure, that's right. Yeah. And obviously, as you know, Margaret Thatcher had a policy of selling them all off, and the money wasn't used to replace them. And ever since then, we've had a huge crisis in social housing. And there's been lots of people, in desperate need who haven't been able to have the homes that they need. And right across the country, where you have Liberal Democrat-run councils are building those social homes, and they are hungry to build more. And I hope the government, any future government can get behind them to do that. But there is a broader issue about bigger top-down housing targets. And, as the MP for St Albans, I've scrutinised this issue of top-down housing targets, and I've come to the conclusion that they just don't work. They just don't work. The one thing they do is they give a mandate to developers to build whatever homes they like, wherever they want to build them, with almost no infrastructure, to make as much money as they like. And it's all driven by the developers. It is not driven by local communities who want to have a better idea of what kind of houses they want, where they want them to be, what infrastructure they want to come with it. And I would like the Liberal, I hope very much that we adopt a policy this weekend, which is about having a sort of bottom-up approach, a community-led approach to planning. So that's what I hope happens this weekend.
But there's a lot of people in the Liberal Democrats who don't agree with you on that, aren't there? That this is going to be vehemently opposed by the young Liberals, who can get very vociferous about all sorts of things, as we all know. How can you bring your party with you?
Well, I hope we can. One thing I would say is one of the things we love about the party, and one of the reasons why I love being a member of the party as well as being deputy leader, is that we can debate these issues. We can debate them openly. We can hear the arguments, and we allow people to make up their minds and to have a vote. And that's really, really important that we do have that discussion. But what I can say is, in St Albans, I can give you a few examples. We've got this enormous sort of tower block, which used to be a set of offices. It was turned into being a set of flats. For a little while, many of those flats were really fantastic because people could live in them, have long-term rent, so they could live there and rent them and work in the city. But then lots of them have been bought up by landlords who rent them out as Airbnb. And that means that you're taking houses out of the long-term rental market, you're using them as a short-term let. Our local authority has no powers whatsoever to regulate the use of those housing units. And so what we have is we don't have enough social homes. So there's overcrowding amongst people who are, the poorest families in our community. We have all these lovely flats that people can't live in and rent because they're being used as Airbnbs with no powers to regulate them. And then you've got developers building these enormous houses that are not actually meeting housing need and housing demand.
But this is difficult, isn't it? Because I think particularly if you're of a liberal persuasion, whether you're a Liberal Democrat or not, there are plenty of Liberals who would not necessarily identify as Liberal Democrats but would say they were Liberals. It's quite something to say that somebody who owns a property has to be regulated, that if they want to use it as an Airbnb, they would say they should have the freedom to do that, whereas you appear to be hinting that actually, because of the serious nature of the housing problem in this country, we might consider saying, well, no, you can't.
I think there is a huge structural inequality in our housing market at the moment and in our planning system. And as a result, yes, I do think that local authorities should have that power. So in St Albans, we are really proud of the fact that we've developed it as a fantastic tourist destination. We have fantastic hospitality. We have some amazing music venues. We have a cathedral. We've got Roman history. We want to have tourists come to St Albans. But if all of the housing is given up for Airbnbs or other short-term lets, it means that young people especially can't afford to rent there because the houses just aren't available. We have to get that balance right, and that means giving local authorities the power to regulate.
We will come to some of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. If you just tuned in and wonder who on earth I'm talking to, it is the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper. She's here to answer your questions between now and 9. It's 22 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
How exciting.
Britain's Conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:24 on LBC. Daisy Cooper is here, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrat conference starts, is it Saturday or Sunday?
Saturday.
And they'll be going through, 5 or 6 days of debating all sorts of different policies, which, to be fair, they're the only party that does this. I mean, that is actually why the Liberal Democrat conference is always quite entertaining, because they're talking about real things, whereas the other two party conferences have actually now become just party rallies. And there's very little of substance, in my opinion, but we will be going to them, I can assure you. Right, let's take a call from Chris in Richmond. Hello, Chris.
Daisy, hi. So I'm a Lib Dem voter. I used to be a member of the party, but I left a couple of years ago because I got fed up with the way the party was debating transgender issues and gender dysphoria. Can you help me understand why is it that the party just kicked out a woman for wearing a T-shirt saying adult human female, but existing members continues to receive abuse just for holding general gender critical views? And I'm more than happy to give you the example if you want, which is out there on social media.
Okay. So the first thing I would say on this issue is that for the vast majority of people in the country identify with their gender with the sex that they're born with, and so the number of people that we're actually talking about who are transgender is incredibly small. And I have been surprised at the sort of the volume of debate and the vociferousness of the debate. And I think one of the things that's really important is that on shows like this and elsewhere in the country that we can have this debate in a civilised way, in a way that we can listen to all different points of view and debate them calmly. And I am very acutely aware that there are many spaces where this debate has become quite toxic and people on different sides of the debate.
It's become quite toxic within the Liberal Democrats, hasn't it? Because you've been banning people for things that most people wouldn't find offensive at all. I mean, you could sit here wearing a T-shirt saying adult human female because you are an adult, you are a human and you are female. Why would you shut someone out of a party for that?
So I would say that I think this debate has become toxic topic for every political party, and every political party is sort of working their way through how to manage it. The party's complaints process is entirely independent of politicians. MPs can't get involved in the complaints process, so I don't know the specific details of that, but of any particular case, because I haven't been involved. But what I would say is with that sort of example that you have just presented, these things are always in context, aren't they? I always say that if you're one woman can be rude to another woman and call them a rude word, and there's no power imbalance there. But if a man says the same thing to a woman, there can be a power imbalance there. And there's also context. So if somebody's wearing a t-shirt to make a statement and they're using it in a particular location or in a place, I don't know, that is intimidating, that maybe that breaches some kind of code of conduct. I don't know the details of that specific case, but what I would say is that I think this is a tricky issue, and it's really important that we try and debate it in a calm way, and try and take the toxicity out of it.
Chris?
Well, frankly, I'm afraid those are just weasel words, right? I will send you after this on Twitter the details involving an individual Lib Dem member being described as a pubic lice infestation for holding gender-critical views. The other point, Daisy, that really annoys me is that the party has done nothing over the last few years to call out the appalling lack of safeguarding when it comes to young people, right? The catastrophe. Look at what happened at the Tavistock clinic, where basically teenagers were basically experimented on. Right, Munira did absolutely nothing about it when she was health spokesman. You've said nothing about it. The party is absolutely silent because it is scared and petrified of upsetting transgender voters. They've literally ruined young people's lives, right, by taking drugs. They've lost their fertility, right, and they seriously regret the decision. There's been serious changes in the NHS regarding the way we treat these patients, and the Lib Dems have said absolutely nothing.
I mean, that is a fair accusation, isn't it? And you are the party's health spokesperson.
So on the first issue, I've had to say to your caller, I don't endorse those kind of, that kind of name calling. I think it's really, distasteful. And if anybody sees anybody calling other members with terms like that, our complaints process is published on our website, and I encourage people to go directly to the complaints process, which is independent, I say, of MPs. But please don't hesitate to use that process. It is out there for those kind of purposes. But separately on this issue, as health spokesperson, I've been incredibly active talking about, some of the really big issues facing our NHS, whether that's, the lack of GPs, whether it's the lack of dentists.
But this is a big issue. What happened at the Tavistock clinic was dreadful, and surely, I think that's a word that most people would use to describe it as, and yet you seem reluctant to comment on it.
Well, I think where there have been failures, it's clearly for regulatory bodies to look at this issue. And, I would hope that, whenever there's new evidence that's presented on whatever the issue is in a health setting, that the appropriate regulators look at the issues and investigate them properly.
I mentioned earlier the Conservative MP Angela Richardson, who was on Cross Question last night. Now, I asked her if she's concerned the Lib Dems could take the seat again at the next election, and this is relevant to this question, by the way, and this is how she replied.
52% of the voting population are women. The Lib Dems can't even define a woman. If they think they're going to get a vote on that basis and form the opposition party, they've got another thing coming.
You must have the odd night where something goes wrong for the government. You think, well, that's me done for.
The thing is, it's a choice for people between Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer. Not Ed Davey. Most people don't even know who Ed Davey is. They might have heard of him, but they've got no idea who he is. I know that he thinks a woman can have a penis.
Does he?
Do you know what? I think it's really disappointing that Conservative MPs are reducing our public debate down to culture wars. I think that's clearly what's going on here. I think Guildford is a seat where we really hope to win at the next general election, and I just think it's really disappointing that MPs talk like this. I'll give you a quick example of something that I've been campaigning on recently. I have been calling for 2 or 3 years for an independent investigation into sexual misconduct and instances of rape in NHS settings and hospital settings. I have held debates in Parliament. I have written to ministers. I have tabled questions. I have constantly raised this issue. I was interviewed for an article which exposed the fact there had been more than 4,000 instances of either rape or sexual assault on NHS settings. And the only question I got from some people was, did it involve transgender people? I am really sick to the back teeth of trying to expose the fact that there are women who are victims of male violence, and there are other people who want to hijack that debate simply to promote their culture wars. It's really not good enough, and I think Angela Richardson needs to apologise.
Do you not think, though, that this whole issue is threatening the Lib Dems at the next election? Because, I mean, I don't... I think asking people that question, can a woman have a penis, is just so gratuitous. I just don't do it. But there are plenty of other people that do. And it will be, I think this is going to be one of those issues that could threaten the Lib Dem polling position at the next election if you and your colleagues can't accept that gender critical views are perfectly reasonable to hold, and you can argue against them, but to be so dogmatic against them, as the Liberal Democrats seem to be, is effectively shutting out a whole group of female voters who just won't accept your current position.
Well, it is perfectly permissible for people to hold that view, but it's a view that I simply don't share. I do think the vast majority of the British public have taken a bit of an approach which is live and let live, and the vast majority of people are not bothered what's inside other people's pants, quite frankly. When I go knocking on doors, and I knock on thousands and thousands of doors in St Albans and other parts of the country, I can tell you what people talk to me about. They talk to me about the NHS, they talk to me about the cost of living crisis, they tell me they can't afford their mortgage, they tell me about SEND provision isn't good enough for their children, they can't get childcare, and they can't afford their rent, they can't secure care for their elderly parents.
So they never talk to you about the trans issue?
It comes up so rarely. Okay. Every now and then it comes up. But in terms of the big issues that people are at the forefront of people's minds, the issues that are going to define the next election, it'll be the NHS and the cost of living.
We will come on to some of those in just a minute, I assure you. It's 8:33 on LBC. Let's get the news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The Chancellor's told LBC tax cuts would still be virtually impossible despite positive signs for the UK economy. The Bank of England kept the base rate of interest at 5.25% earlier, and inflation fell unexpectedly in August. Police are looking for a missing mother and 2 children after a man was arrested on suspicion of abduction. Police say Jamie Lee Kelly left a centre for vulnerable mothers and children in Colindale in northwest London on Tuesday. A former soldier has denied escaping prison in Wandsworth while awaiting trial for terror offences. 21-year-old Daniel Khalif is being held at HMP Belmarsh. LBC weather turning drier for most tonight. Sharp showers continuing in the far southeast of England and a low of 6 degrees.
This is LBC.
This is what
LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:36 on LBC. Daisy Cooper, the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, is here answering your calls and texts. Adrian in Solihull says, Daisy, please tell us, what do the Lib Dems intend to do about the very negative effects of Brexit? Rejoining or getting closer? Bilateral agreements, maybe? Particularly asking with regards to millions of Brits feeling very upset with the 90 in 180 days restriction on travel. The Lib Dems need to be open and clear about this. Well, at the last general election, you were very, very open and clear, perhaps too open and clear, and it didn't do you a lot of good, did it?
Well, let me try and be open and clear this evening. So then let's see how that goes in, shall we?
Yeah.
The first thing I would say, I genuinely think that Brexit's been an unmitigated disaster, right? And I see it, day in, day out in my own constituency. We have got hospitality businesses that can't get the staff. We've got small businesses that are completely wrapped up in red tape. We've got farmers.
Have you ever thought to say to them, why don't you pay them more then?
Oh, I mean, there are hospitality businesses that are paying their staff incredibly well, but don't forget that hospitality businesses are really struggling at the moment with a number of different issues in their headwinds. They're still paying back their COVID loans. They're having seen their business rates going up. They're dealing with energy prices because the business support for energy bills was withdrawn by Rishi Sunak. Hospitality businesses are really struggling, and even when they pay incredibly well, and often they're paying so well, they're having to recruit people out of our social care services and out of the NHS, right? So even when they do pay well, they often can't be open all the time. But there are lots of different parts of our economy that are really, really suffering. And so it's really important that we find a way forward as a country. What we've said as a party is, we were the only UK-wide party that voted against the Conservatives' botched Brexit deal. And we're the only UK-wide party that has set out a four-stage plan as to how we're going to rebuild our relationship with the European Union. There are things that could be happening right now if the government wanted to do it. Then we know they don't, but if they wanted to right now, to renegotiate or start renegotiating the deal that we have in order to try and get rid of some of that red tape, to look at other programmes that we might be able to take part in.
But in order to persuade the EU to do that, we would have to go to the EU and say, well, we want to do this earlier than 2025 because that's when it's supposed to happen. And in order for you to do that, we understand that we'll need to give you something. What should we give them?
Well, look, I think the issue at the moment, and you've really kind of touched on this, is that trust has broken down so much between the UK and the EU. It's going to take a long time to rebuild this trust.
I think it had. But whatever you think of Rishi Sunak, he is different to Liz Truss. He's very different to Boris Johnson. I think he has rebuilt relations with European leaders to an extent. Obviously, you think he should go further. But I come back to that question. What can we give them that would encourage them to start the negotiations early?
Well, I think that's part of the negotiations, isn't it? But as I was saying,
well, it isn't, because they won't start them unless we're prepared to say, well, look, we want X, Y, and Z, and in return we'll give you this. You must have an idea of what this might be.
Well, I think if we were to signal that we wanted to join some of the EU-wide programmes, like Erasmus, for example, that would be of benefit to people in this country who'd want to study abroad in the EU countries. But
we
EU
have just
people
rejoined Horizon, haven't
we? We have just rejoined Horizon. We should never have left in the first place.
Well, that was down to the EU, not us. We always wanted to stay in it.
Well, it's taken a long time, hasn't it, for the government to get around to rejoining that programme. So we should have joined Horizon a long time ago. And we should be signalling our intent to rejoin other programmes, whether it's, it's quite boring technical things, but, aligning our, standards around chemicals, whether it's, renegotiating veterinary agreements. There's all sorts of things like that, simplifying VAT. There's all sorts of things that we could start to negotiate. And I think there's many EU countries that would actually be quite keen on seeing those discussions start a little bit earlier. So those are the things that we could be doing right now. But as I say, we are the only party that's setting out a sort of four-stage plan as to how we can really genuinely rebuild that relationship with the EU. I can't emphasise just how badly that trust has been broken, but we've set out a path as to how we can rebuild it and hopefully build a strong relationship with the EU once again.
Do you want to go back into the single market?
So I mentioned that we have this 4-stage plan and some of the things that we could be doing right now. Stage 1 and 2 is very much around renegotiating the current deal and looking at programmes like Erasmus and other things we could do there. Stage 3 of our plan is to look at other trade deals around the world that we could improve. And stage 4 is then looking at rejoining the single market. So I hope one day, eventually, that might be a possibility, but we have got to set out a path for doing that because that's just not on the table right now. However much some people might wish it was, it's not on the table right now, but we have set out a 4-stage plan and that's our end destination.
Because it's not as clear as the plan in the last election, which was to just rejoin. And I've often wondered why we're now 7 years after the referendum, 3 years or 3.5 years after we actually formally left. It's a real surprise to me that there doesn't seem to be any sort of really impactful rejoin movement, which the Liberal Democrats could be at the forefront of, even though, and you will know this, 25% of your voters actually voted to leave. So does that sort of hold you back from taking a leading role there?
I think it's a couple of things. I mean, the first thing I would say is that the world has changed. And the second thing I would say is that I think people don't want to go backwards. I think a lot of people feel very scarred. I know I certainly do, about the divisions that appeared in relationships, in families, in communities over that sort of Brexit divide that used to exist. And so rather than looking backwards, it's really important that we look forwards. And that's what we are trying to do as a party. We are looking forward. We do want to rebuild that relationship with the EU. And we want the UK to be, at the heart of Europe once again. But we have to have pragmatic steps to achieve that. And that's why we set out a 4-stage plan to do just that.
Would you eventually, maybe in 10 or 20 years, like to see Britain rejoin?
Well, look, I campaigned for the UK to stay in the European Union, and I wish we'd never left, right? But let's see where we are in the future. The fact is the EU could be a very different beast in 10 or 20 years' time. Who knows where the UK is going to be? But what I can say is it's really important that we rebuild our economy, because if we're going to start those negotiations about building that stronger relationship with the EU, we need to have a strong negotiating position, and we'll only have that if we have a strong economy. And at the moment, our economy, thanks to Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, our economy is on its knees.
Well, you could have just said yes to that question, because that's clearly what you would ideally want to do.
Well, as I say, look, I mean, I didn't want to leave the EU.
No,
right? I didn't want to leave the EU. I wish the UK had stayed
I'm not
in the EU.
I'm not saying to you, do you think we should rejoin now? But just in your heart, in 20 years' time, or in maybe 40 years' time, when you're sort of out of politics, maybe, who knows, would you like to think that by the time that you and I both depart this mortal coil, that we will be back?
If at that point in time I believed it was the right thing for the UK to do, then yes, absolutely. I mean, in my heart, I think I'm an internationalist, right? I'm an internationalist through and through. It's part of what makes me a Liberal Democrat. We are internationalists. We want to have close cooperation. And in my heart, yes, I hope that maybe we would rejoin the EU, and that would be the best thing for the country. But one of the things I've learned over the last 3 years is that you can't predict the future. A huge amount has happened in the political world since I was elected just 3 years ago. So I'm a bit reluctant to predict where we might be in 20.
James says, Daisy is sharper than any member of the cabinet. I mean, I think that's a bit of a backhanded compliment. It's a pretty low bar at the moment, isn't it? And Kenny says, can you ask Daisy, this is going to be the most challenging question of the night.
Oh, go on.
Actually, no, that wasn't the one I thought it was. Sorry, this is from Dave in St Albans saying, on a lighter note, please tell Daisy that we're looking forward to seeing her at St Albans Beer and Cider Festival on Saturday, and we'll have a lovely pint of cider waiting for her. What could possibly go wrong?
Hopefully nothing. It's a fantastic festival. You'll know that St Albans is the home of CAMRA, and we love our beer festivals.
If you're late for the Lib Dem conference, we'll all know why.
I'll be at the beer festival on Wednesday, actually.
All right. We'll take more of your calls in a moment. Not on the beer festival. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask Daisy a question. It's 8:45.
LBC Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
If you're watching this and wondering why Daisy and I are laughing, it's because I just got a news alert on my phone saying Tory MP punched in the face, but it wouldn't bring up the story. So I just said to Chris, my producer, can you find out who this is? Hoping to get a reaction then from Daisy. It's Matt Hancock on a TV show. So lack of news story there, I think. Right, Daisy Cooper is here, Deputy Leader of the Lib Dems, answering your questions. Let's go to Phil in Penrith. Hello, Phil.
Hello, how are you doing?
All right, thank you. What would you like to ask?
I'd like to ask Daisy, what would be the Lib Dem policy on the Ukraine, please?
That's a very wide question. Daisy?
It's a very wide question. The first thing I would say, and thank you for the question, the first thing I would say is that this is one area where, thankfully, there has been a huge amount of cross-party agreement and solidarity with Ukraine. I think the war shocked all of us, or the full invasion shocked all of us. And I think that, it's right that we've been supporting Ukraine in the way that we have. Liberal Democrats have been consistently supportive of saying we need to give Ukraine the weapons, every weapon that they ask for that we're able to give. We give support to that. And I think it's really important that we continue to support Ukraine right until the end of the war. I think it's important that we support Ukraine until Russia has kicked out of Ukraine in its entirety. We've got our Liberal Democrat Autumn Conference this weekend. We have Kira Rudik, who's a Ukrainian Member of Parliament, coming to speak at the conference. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing her speak and to talk firsthand about some of the challenges that they're facing.
There are people who think that there ought to be some sort of peace conference or peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. Do you think that's something that ought to happen? And if so, how? I mean, who decides what peace means?
I think any decision about whether or not that peace conference should even take place should be the decision of the Ukrainian people and of the Ukrainian government. I think, from everything that I've heard so far, my understanding is that the Ukrainian people do want to beat Putin, and they want to defeat him, and they want to push Russian soldiers out of all of their territory. And if that is the wish of the Ukrainian people, then I think it's incumbent on us to support them in that.
It is incredible how much political consensus there is in this country about Ukraine, in that all political parties, I think I'm right in saying, seem to have an identical view on this. Really, what you've just articulated. Is that healthy for democracy?
I think it is, because actually what we've seen is that Putin has waged an illegal war, and he is posing a threat to all of us who hold democratic values. And therefore, I think all of us who value democracy, who value the rule of law, who believe that sovereign territory should be sovereign, have to stand up to Putin and his allies. And so it's important that we do hold a united front on this issue.
Phil, your reaction?
Well, am I detecting a bit of a hard line against the war in places like the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, etc.? And there seems to be some weakening of this attitude that Daisy is very adamant about this, which I'm pleased to hear, by the way. But there seems to be a weakening of determination in some of the Eastern European countries.
Well, I think you're right in the case of Poland. They've said they're stopping giving any more weapons to Ukraine because the two governments are in dispute over grain exports. But unless you know something different, I must admit I haven't heard that about other countries in Eastern Europe.
Czech Republic and Hungary, there's a strong movement in support of Russia at the moment.
I'm less surprised about Hungary, I have to say, but that's another story. Phil, thank you very much. Let's take a text here from Graham in Quorn, who says the Lib Dems backed having a referendum but didn't like the democratic result. Well, I'm not sure that's totally true, is it? You didn't actually back having a EU referendum back in the day, did you?
Well, I mean, he said he didn't like the result. I mean, fundamentally...
Well, let me go on with the rest of the text. But I don't remember the Lib Dems agreeing with David Cameron saying, yes, we should have a referendum. Anyway, so they went to the polls in the 2019 election vowing to reverse it if elected, and received a well-deserved drubbing. How can I trust a party which showed such disregard to the result of the aforementioned very democratic referendum?
Well, look, we all know how that election ended, and it's fair to say that we spent a long time licking our wounds, not just from the electoral defeat, but also from leaving the EU. For us as internationalists, it was a really significant, really, really important campaign, and we put everything on the line to try and to keep ourselves in the EU. But what we said was that we wanted there to be more democracy. So we said that if there was a general election and if the people gave us a mandate to do that, then that would be part of our manifesto.
But in retrospect, that was one of the stupidest policies that any political party has gone to an election on, wasn't it?
Sure. I think in retrospect, there's lots of things we probably should have done differently. And, with hindsight, we probably should have gone in, stuck to our guns on calling for a people's vote, and perhaps we might have got it. But, I wasn't elected at the time. I was, in the party, and I was part of those debates. And I think for many of us, it just felt like a very, very significant issue. And we wanted to do absolutely everything we possibly could to push that issue through. But let's also recognise that Boris Johnson also wanted to do everything that he could to push Brexit through, and therefore illegally prorogued Parliament. So that undermining our democratic credentials there as well. But fundamentally, what I would say is there's water under the bridge. We've shown in the last couple of years that we are leading and winning the battle of ideas, being the first party to call for the windfall tax on the big oil and gas companies, the first party to call for the energy price hike to be scrapped last autumn, the first party to call for a government action on this crisis of raw sewage being pumped into our rivers. And I hope very much that in the coming months we'll continue to lead the battle of ideas on how we can save our NHS for the future and improve people's health as well. That's something we'll be talking about at our conference. So hopefully we'll be talking about the issues that resonate with people. If they like what we say, then hopefully we can rebuild that trust.
Ali is in Barnet. Hello, Ali.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I just wanted to quickly ask, obviously I'm one of the students who, well, at the time I was a student, but I'm one of the first wave of people who was affected by the Lib Dems, not doing anything about the price rises in student fees for university fees. Obviously, I remember back then Nick Clegg had sort of pledged to oppose any raise in tuition fees, and then lo and behold, they suddenly went from 3,000 to 9,000. And obviously, ever since then, I would never trusted anything that the Lib Dem said. What is the party going to do to win back the trust of that generation and also today's sort of students? Because I'm sure they look back and don't see favourably on that. So what's your competitive policy? I know Labour has a policy and they have plans to sort of tackle student finance fees in some sort of way, whether that's reducing the percentage of fees they repay every month on their student loans or whatever. What's the Lib Dems policy on that, and how do they plan to get the trust back?
Sure. Well, back then, I wasn't an MP, but I was
you were going to say that.
But, no,
nothing
wait for
to
it.
do with
no,
me,
no,
girl.
I wasn't going to say that. I had stood in that general election, and I was a party member, and I actually went on the march against the rise in tuition fees because I felt very strongly at the time that we had made that pledge and we shouldn't have broken it. So that was my view at the time. With hindsight, looking back, what we can see is, whatever we think about that policy, it did stabilise finances for our British universities, and part of the policy that was brought in by Coalition did actually make sure that there was a chunk of money that was reserved for people from the poorest backgrounds to make sure that they had they could actually access university courses. What I would say is that since then, with the Conservatives being left to their own devices, they have scrapped maintenance grants altogether. They have raised the salary. They've lowered the salary in terms of when you start paying back your loan as well, and that's made it really, really difficult for a lot of young people who are at university. I definitely think we need to have a review of the system. We need to have a review of those student finances, but it also needs to be part of a broader strategy as to how we're going to make sure that our young people have the education and the skills for the future. There's a really important debate to be had about apprenticeships and about university and how we can have young people who are who develop a joy and a love of learning and at the same time have the skills that we need in our economy. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area, but I would agree that there needs to be a review.
Ali?
I appreciate that, I contributed to stabilising the universities, but at the time I wasn't old enough to vote. And overnight I was 3 times more in debt than I should have been, and I had no say on the matter. So I appreciate that, but I'm not really hearing a concrete sort of plan on So, I mean, I think obviously Labour wasn't in charge of that, but they've got a plan to say, look, we're going to reduce this, and this specific policies and
They were
specific
the
points.
ones that introduced fees in the first place, remember?
Well, yeah. But, I mean, obviously they didn't contribute to the rise. I mean, 3,000 sounds a bit more reasonable than 9,000. I could have had 3 degrees for the price of the one that I paid for. And I'm still going to pay for the foreseeable future for the next 30 years, really. So I think Lib Dems are in a position to try and, do something to, make that wrong right, right their wrongs, really. And I don't know. I'm not really hearing any concrete policy or any concrete plan for that. So.
Sure. Well, I'd say we are working on the details of that. What I can say is that we would like to reinstate some of the principles that we embedded in the first place. So things like making sure that people from the poorest backgrounds have the ability to go, and that means that a portion of the fees that are paid by most students, a portion of that is put into a pot to enable people from the poorest backgrounds to go to university, because that gap in inequality is really, really damaging for individuals, but also for our economy. We do need to raise the cap, raise the sort of level at which young people have to start paying back those student fees. I don't know exactly where that number would sit at the moment, but I take the point that it is really difficult for people to go to university when they know they're going to have to pay so much back as soon as they graduate.
And we've got to the end of the hour, Daisy, I'm afraid. Thank you very much indeed. Hope you have a great conference. If you're going to the Lib Dem conference, I'm going to be there on the Sunday. We're doing For the Many Live with Jackie Smith, and Layla Moran's going to be our special guest. If you'd like to attend that, you don't need a conference pass. If you live anywhere in Dorset, come along as well. Just go to www.forthemany.live. Thank you very much, Daisy.
Thank you.
Now, coming up in the next hour, we're going to stick with an education theme, in fact, building on what our last caller said there, because it was today revealed that fewer school leavers in the UK have been accepted onto a higher education course this year, and the number of disadvantaged 18-year-olds going to university has fallen. Now, a total of 270,350 18-year-olds have been accepted onto a course since they received their A-level results. That's down 1.8% on last year. Now, in theory, you would think that was a bad thing. But there is an argument to say, no, that may be actually a good thing, because